You find yourself standing on the windswept steppes of Mongolia in 1206. The ground beneath your boots is still warm with blood from yesterday's conquest. In the distance, smoke rises from what was once a thriving city, now reduced to ash and silence. But the screams you hear aren't from battle. They're coming from the great felt tent ahead, where the man who will reshape the world is conducting what his people call the choosing ceremony. Inside that tent, Genghis Khan, born Temüjin, now master of the largest contiguous empire in human history, stands before a line of captive women. Some are princesses, others merchants' wives, many barely more than children. They've been stripped, examined, and sorted according to criteria that would make your blood run cold. This isn't random violence. This is systematic sexual warfare designed not just to satisfy one man's appetites, but to literally breed a new world order. What history textbooks call Mongol expansion was actually the most sophisticated program of sexual conquest ever devised. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer territories, he conquered wombs, bloodlines, and genetic futures. Modern DNA studies reveal that roughly 16 million men alive today carry his genetic signature. That's not the result of a few affairs. That's the result of systematic sexual warfare conducted on an industrial scale. These aren't just medical case studies. These are stories of how a bacterial infection could topple dynasties and bloodlines and drive crown princes to, well, let's just say they made some very permanent life decisions. The disease that medical texts coldly call treponema pallidum became the hidden architect of European history, working its destruction one royal bedroom at a time. Actually, scratch that. Wrong script. We're talking about something far more systematic than syphilis, though arguably just as devastating to human civilization. We're talking about the man who turned reproduction into a weapon of mass destruction. Before we descend into these cursed chambers where empire met appetite, tell me, in the comments, where in the world are you hearing this story? Our community spans every corner of the globe, all drawn to those moments when official history crumbles under the weight of uncomfortable truths. Welcome to Cursed Chambers, where we learn that some appetites were large enough to literally reshape the gene pool of half the world. Let's start with what seems reasonable, understanding Mongol marriage customs, because surely there's a rational explanation for how one man's romantic life ended up affecting the DNA of 16 million people. Surely. Mongol society was nomadic, practical, and surprisingly egalitarian by medieval standards. Women could own property, divorce their husbands, and even rule in their absence. Marriage was often strategic, cementing alliances between tribes and ensuring genetic diversity across the harsh steppes. So far, so civilized. When young Temüjin married Börte in 1184, it appeared to be a typical tribal arrangement, two families joining forces for mutual protection and prosperity. Börte was intelligent, loyal, and would become Genghis Khan's most trusted advisor. Their marriage seemed to represent the best of Mongol traditions, partnership rather than possession. Oh, how sweet. But even in this normal context, some interesting patterns emerge. Mongol marriage law included something called wife capture, where men could claim women as wives through ritual abduction. What modern eyes might see as kidnapping, Mongol society framed as romantic pursuit. The logic was practical. On the steppe, survival required strong alliances, and marriage by capture demonstrated a man's strength while creating bonds between formerly hostile tribes. Think of it as medieval speed dating, but with more horses and considerably less consent involved. The cultural justification was elegant. If you could successfully capture a woman and keep her for 3 days without her family rescuing her, then clearly the spirits approved of the match. It was like trial by combat, but with wedding planning instead of swords. Now, this might sound problematic to modern sensibilities, but remember, we're dealing with a nomadic society where survival depended on forming quick alliances and demonstrating strength. It's not like they had a harmony. But here's where things start to get interesting. As Genghis Khan's empire expanded, his approach to these strategic partnerships began to evolve in ways that would make a modern HR department spontaneously combust. As the Mongol Empire grew, so did their interpretation of what constituted appropriate acquisition protocols. Court records from conquered cities reveal increasingly younger brides being selected for the Khan's household. What started as adult strategic marriages gradually shifted toward what chroniclers euphemistically called early diplomatic integration. Chinese court documents describe 12-year-old princesses being prepared for Mongol cultural adaptation. Persian records mention 10-year-old daughters of defeated nobles undergoing suitability assessments for the Khan's growing household. The Mongols called it future investment, securing the loyalty of conquered peoples by raising their daughters within Mongol traditions from a malleable age. Now I know what you're thinking. Surely this is just medieval marriage customs. Didn't everyone marry young back then? And yes, arranged marriages involving young people were common in medieval societies. But there's a difference between a strategic marriage between teenager nobles and what the Mongols were developing, which was starting to look less like diplomacy and more like, well, let's call it aggressive human resources management. The logic was sophisticated if deeply disturbing adult women retained loyalties to their birth cultures, but children could be completely reshaped according to Mongol values. Young girls taken from defeated cities would grow up speaking Mongol, worshipping Mongol gods, and bearing children who would see the Khan as their rightful father figure. But the preparation process became increasingly systematized in ways that should make your skin crawl. Medical examinations to verify health and development potential, cultural education that stripped away previous identities, physical conditioning that modern child psychologists would recognize as systematic trauma designed to create complete dependence on their captors. And here's where we need to pause and acknowledge that we're no longer talking about rough but normal medieval marriage customs. We're starting to describe something that looks suspiciously like systematic trafficking, with a side of cultural genocide and a generous helping of what we'd now recognize as child abuse. The ages were dropping from 16-18 to 12-14 and sometimes younger. The cultural preparation was lasting months or years. Medical examinations were becoming more invasive, and records show increasing mentions of resistance being corrected through patience, which is possibly the most chilling euphemism in all of medieval literature. But surely it couldn't get worse than systematic cultural reprogramming of captured children. Right. Oh, sweet summer child. We haven't even gotten to the medical procedures yet. Court physicians' records reveal the true nature of what the Mongols called preparation. And I'm going to need you to sit down for this part. Maybe pour yourself something strong, or something caffeinated, or both. Mongol court documents translated from Persian and Chinese sources describe systematic medical procedures designed to ensure young captives could fulfill their household duties as quickly as possible. These weren't health checkups, they were surgical modifications performed on children to make them, let's say, more accommodating to adult male attention. Chinese court physician records that survived in monastery archives describe procedures performed on girls as young as 9 to prepare their bodies for imperial service. The euphemistic language can't hide what modern medicine recognizes as systematic surgical intervention performed on children. The procedures were performed by teams of physicians who had developed specialized techniques for what they called accelerated maturation. Girls were subjected to internal examinations with instruments, surgical modifications to internal anatomy, and systematic administration of substances designed to trigger early puberty. Many died from infections or complications. Those who survived were permanently damaged. Persian court records describe the examination tents where captured girls underwent these procedures. The accounts describe children screaming for days, physicians working in assembly line fashion, and Khan's officials inspecting the results like livestock evaluations. I'm going to take a moment here to let that sink in. We're talking about medieval field hospitals specifically designed to surgically modify children's bodies to make them sexually available to adults. This isn't accidental harm or cultural misunderstanding. This is systematic, intentional, industrial-scale child abuse disguised as medical procedure. The goal wasn't medical care, it was manufacturing sexual availability in children's bodies through surgical intervention. And they had developed efficient, systematic methods for doing this to large numbers of children at once. So let me pause here and make sure we understand what we've uncovered so far. We started with what appeared to be nomadic marriage customs, rough but within historical norms for medieval societies. We discovered that these customs evolved into systematic acquisition of younger and younger captives. We learned that the cultural preparation involved months or years of systematic psychological conditioning designed to break existing loyalties and create complete dependence. And now we've discovered that Mongol court physicians were performing surgical procedures on children, some as young as 9 years old, specifically designed to make their bodies sexually available to adult men regardless of the massive trauma, permanent damage, and frequent death this caused. This isn't nomadic marriage customs anymore. This isn't even systematic conquest and assimilation. This is industrial-scale child sexual abuse disguised as imperial policy and justified by concepts of genetic destiny and empire building. We're looking at what may be the largest organized program of child sexual abuse in human history, conducted by the man whose genetic signature appears in 16 million modern descendants. The Mongol Empire wasn't just built on military conquest, it was built on the systematic sexual abuse of children on a scale that makes individual monsters look almost quaint by comparison. Genghis Khan had discovered that systematic sexual trauma could be weaponized for imperial expansion. Children who survived the preparation process were so completely broken and dependent that they became absolutely loyal to the system that had destroyed them. They raised their own children to serve the Khan's household, without question. The trauma wasn't a side effect, it was the intended outcome. And if you think that's the worst of it, wait until we examine exactly how this systematic abuse was organized, because it turns out the Mongols had developed what can only be described as an industrial complex for processing human beings into reproductive resources. The evidence comes from multiple independent sources that paint a picture so systematic and horrifying that part of me wishes it was just medieval propaganda rather than documented historical reality. The most damning evidence comes from administrative records. The Mongols were excellent record keepers, and they treated their systematic abuse program like any other administrative function. They kept detailed records of acquisitions, processing procedures, and outcomes. These aren't emotional accounts or propaganda, they're bureaucratic documents that treat systematic child abuse as a routine administrative function. Chinese Yuan dynasty court records document medical procedures in clinical detail. Persian administrative records track numbers processed through various facilities. Mongol legal codes include specific provisions for captive integration that read like modern trafficking guidelines. European missionary accounts corroborate the systematic nature across multiple regions and time periods. Modern archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. Excavations of Mongol encampments reveal specialized medical facilities, mass burial sites of young females, and artifacts consistent with systematic medical procedures being performed on large numbers of people. But the most damning evidence is genetic. DNA analysis provides proof that can't be argued with or dismissed as historical bias. The genetic signature attributed to Genghis Khan appears in roughly 0.5% of all men worldwide, approximately 16 million individuals. This level of genetic penetration is impossible through normal reproductive patterns. It requires systematic, large-scale reproductive activity conducted over decades. Let me put that in perspective. One man's genetic signature appears in 16 million living descendants. That's more than the entire population of most countries. That's not the result of a few affairs or even a large harem of willing partners. That's the genetic fingerprint of systematic sexual violence conducted on an industrial scale. And the Mongols had developed sophisticated systems for maximizing this genetic spread while minimizing the administrative burden of managing thousands of traumatized captives. Mongol court documents describe a three-stage process designed to completely destroy captive girls' previous identities and rebuild them as extensions of the Khan's household. Stage 1 was separation and disorientation. Captive girls were immediately separated from all family members and cultural connections. They were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining any customs from their birth cultures. Those who attempted to maintain previous identities were subjected to systematic punishment designed to associate their birth culture with pain and terror. Think of it as cultural deprogramming, but with the goal of creating human blank slates rather than recovering cult members. Stage 2 was physical modification. The medical procedures served multiple purposes beyond creating sexual access. They created permanent physical markers that identified the girls as belonging to the Khan's household. The trauma and permanent damage created physical dependence on Mongol physicians and caregivers. Most importantly, the procedures created psychological associations between survival and submission to Mongol authority. Stage 3 was psychological reconstruction. Survivors of the physical procedures underwent systematic psychological conditioning, designed to replace their previous identities with complete loyalty to the Khan. This included forced participation in the abuse of newer captives, creating complicity that made psychological escape impossible. It's like Stockholm Syndrome, but engineered from the ground up, with medieval efficiency. But the ultimate goal wasn't just sexual gratification, it was genetic imperialism. Genghis Khan understood that controlling reproduction meant controlling the future. Children born from his systematic abuse would carry his genetic signature while being raised within Mongol culture, creating a generation that was biologically his while being culturally Mongol. The children of abused captives were systematically tracked and managed according to their perceived utility to the empire. Boys who showed military potential were raised as soldiers. Girls were evaluated for their potential as future mothers of Khan's descendants. Those deemed unfit were eliminated or abandoned. It was eugenics before the word existed, implemented through systematic sexual violence and administered with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed the Nazis. Now, you might be wondering if anyone tried to resist this systematic horror show. The answer is yes, and their stories deserve to be remembered, because they remind us that even in the darkest historical circumstances, human dignity finds ways to assert itself. Despite the systematic nature of the abuse, historical records preserve accounts of resistance that remind us these were human beings, not objects. The most famous resistance came from within the Khan's own family. Hoelun, Genghis Khan's great-great-granddaughter, refused to marry and demanded that suitors defeat her in wrestling matches. She reportedly defeated hundreds of men, accumulated thousands of horses as winnings, and eventually ruled a significant territory independently. Her rebellion represented rejection of the entire system that treated women as reproductive resources. Chinese court records describe networks of captive women who poisoned Mongol officials and attempted to poison the Khan himself. These women understood they couldn't escape, but they could resist by trying to destroy the system from within. Some captive women who learned to read and write used their literacy to document the abuse they experienced, hiding accounts in monastery archives and court records. These documents provide some of our most detailed evidence of what really happened in the Khan's household. These acts of resistance were largely unsuccessful in stopping the systematic abuse, but they preserve evidence that even under the most extreme circumstances, human beings will fight to maintain their dignity and protect others from suffering. But here's the truly chilling realization: Genghis Khan's sexual practices weren't personal perversions. They were systematic imperial strategy. He had discovered that controlling reproduction was more effective than controlling territory. Traditional empires conquered land and imposed taxes. The Mongol Empire conquered wombs and imposed genetics. The scale was unprecedented. Conservative estimates suggest that Genghis Khan's household contained over 500 wives and concubines at any given time, with thousands more rotating through the system over his lifetime. The majority were children when first captured, and the systematic abuse they experienced was designed not just to satisfy the Khan's appetites, but to create a generation of children whose loyalty to the Mongol Empire was literally bred into their bones. This wasn't random violence. It was the world's first systematic program of genetic imperialism. Genghis Khan understood that traditional conquest was temporary, but genetic conquest was permanent. Every child born from his systematic abuse carried his genetic signature into the future, ensuring that his empire would persist even if his political institutions collapsed. The success of this strategy is visible today in DNA analysis that shows his genetic influence spanning from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. The Mongol Empire collapsed centuries ago, but Genghis Khan's genetic empire continues to expand through normal reproduction, creating a biological legacy that dwarfs any traditional imperial achievement. In a very real sense, Genghis Khan achieved a form of immortality through systematic sexual violence. His genes continue to spread through normal reproduction, meaning that his genetic influence grows stronger over time, rather than fading. It's possibly the most successful reproductive strategy in human history, achieved through methods that represent some of the worst systematic abuse in human history. The immediate consequences of Genghis Khan's systematic sexual warfare reshaped the demographics of Asia in ways that persist today. The forced integration of conquered populations created genetic mixing on an unprecedented scale, but at the cost of systematic trauma that affected entire civilizations. Chinese population records from the Yuan dynasty show dramatic changes in birth patterns and genetic markers that indicate massive forced reproduction. Persian administrative documents describe similar demographic shifts. European missionary accounts report encountering populations that showed clear signs of systematic genetic mixing through non-consensual means. The psychological consequences were equally devastating. Societies that had experienced Mongol conquest developed cultural patterns consistent with systematic trauma. Traditional family structures collapsed. Religious practices shifted toward themes of submission and survival. Art and literature from conquered regions shows consistent themes of helplessness and fatalism that persisted for generations. Its cultural PTSD on a civilizational scale and its effects can still be traced in modern Central Asian and Chinese cultures that emphasize submission to authority and acceptance of systematic abuse as normal parts of life. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed what historical records suggested. Genghis Khan's systematic sexual violence created one of the largest genetic legacies in human history. Roughly 16 million men alive today carry Y-chromosome markers associated with the Mongol expansion, representing approximately 0.5% of all male humans. This genetic evidence forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we remember historical figures. Genghis Khan is often celebrated as a military genius and empire builder, but the genetic evidence suggests that his most lasting achievement was systematic sexual violence conducted on an industrial scale. The children and descendants of his victims live with his genetic legacy, often without knowing the traumatic circumstances of their ancestry. Modern Mongolia celebrates Genghis Khan as a national hero, while millions of people worldwide carry genetic evidence of systematic sexual violence in their own DNA. It's like discovering your family tree was fertilized with trauma and there's a statue commemorating the perpetrator in the town square. But here's the really disturbing part. This transformation of systematic sexual predator into celebrated historical figure reveals how societies construct narratives that allow them to admire successful monsters. The same pattern appears throughout history. When someone achieves sufficiently large-scale success, their crimes become tactics, their victims become casualties, and their systematic abuse becomes historical context. This psychological mechanism serves important social functions. It allows us to study historical effectiveness without confronting moral horror. It permits admiration for achievement, while avoiding responsibility for consequences. Most importantly, it creates distance between historical atrocities and contemporary values, allowing us to believe that such systematic evil couldn't happen in our more enlightened era. But this distance is dangerous. The same psychological and social mechanisms that enabled Genghis Khan's systematic sexual violence operate in contemporary contexts. The dehumanization of victims, the systematic nature of abuse, the institutional protection of perpetrators, and the transformation of systematic violence into policy, these patterns persist in modern forms. The most chilling realization is that Genghis Khan's approach was successful precisely because it was systematic rather than random. Individual acts of sexual violence create individual trauma. Systematic sexual violence creates cultural trauma that reshapes entire civilizations. The Mongol Empire understood this and weaponized sexual violence as a tool of permanent conquest. Contemporary conflicts continue to use systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war, indicating that the lessons of Mongol conquest haven't been lost, they've been refined. From Bosnia to Rwanda to contemporary conflicts, systematic sexual violence remains a tool for destroying enemy populations from within, creating trauma that persists for generations. The ultimate lesson from Genghis Khan's cursed chambers isn't just about historical sexual violence. It's about how systematic evil disguises itself as policy, protects itself through institutional power, and perpetuates itself by transforming victims into tools of further abuse. Understanding these mechanisms in historical context is essential for recognizing them in contemporary forms. When we see systematic abuse being justified as policy, when we see institutional protection of abusers, when we see victims being blamed for their own victimization, we're seeing the same patterns that allowed Genghis Khan to transform systematic child abuse into genetic imperialism. The genetic shadow of his systematic violence continues to spread through normal reproduction, meaning that his crimes literally continue to expand their influence with each generation. It's a form of evil that achieves immortality through biological rather than cultural transmission. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it worked. From a purely strategic perspective, Genghis Khan's systematic sexual violence was incredibly successful. His genetic legacy dwarfs any other human in recorded history. His empire lasted longer than most civilizations. His strategic innovations continue to influence military thinking today. We're forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that systematic evil can be highly effective, that moral monsters can achieve lasting success, and that our historical narratives often celebrate effectiveness while ignoring the human cost of achievement. What strikes you most about this systematic transformation of sexual violence into imperial strategy? How do you think we should remember historical figures whose achievements were built on systematic abuse? And what parallels do you see between Mongol sexual warfare tactics and contemporary conflicts? Let me know in the comments, and remember, the past has many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and not all of them are buried as deep as the powerful would like us to believe. The chamber doors close behind us, but the genetic echo of systematic violence travels forward through time, carried in the DNA of millions who may never know the traumatic origin of their biological inheritance. Some legacies are written in stone, others are written in genes. Both can last forever, but only one continues to spread.